Welcome back, everyone. To kick things off, it's a fun idea if you tell me where you're tuning in from in the comments. Thank you. Please like and subscribe. Now let's relax and start the show. I watched her from across the room, my fingers wrapped loosely around the stem of my glass. Julia was smiling, laughing, her perfect mask still in place, as if nothing had changed. The same polished facade she'd worn for years, only now I knew the truth. I had known for months. It was almost amusing how little she suspected, how secure she felt in her lies. And yet, everything around her was falling apart, piece by piece, slipping from her grasp in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. That's how it had to be, slow, subtle, inevitable, not like her betrayal. Her affair had been crude, predictable, full of sloppy mistakes. My revenge would be precise, methodical. I took a sip of my drink, letting the cool liquid roll over my tongue. Tonight would be another small step in a much larger plan. I had prepared the groundwork weeks ago, planting doubts, nudging events in just the right direction. Julia had no idea what was coming for her. She had no idea how much of her life I now controlled, how every person she trusted had begun to drift away. As I stood there watching her laugh with a group of people she thought were her friends, I reflected on how far things had come. The destruction I had engineered felt like a slow, calculated chess game, one where I knew every move before she made hers. There had been no room for error, no impulsiveness. Everything had to be perfect. I thought back to when it started, to that night when I found the text messages. David's name lit up on her phone screen, the words all too clear. I remembered the gut punch of seeing the plans they had made, the way her body language shifted whenever she spoke to him. But instead of confronting her then, I did what she didn't expect. I waited. I gathered information, watching her from the shadows as she carried on her pathetic little affair. I didn't need to scream or demand answers. Her betrayal had already given me all the clarity I needed. The door to the room opened, and in walked David, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Julia. I caught the flicker of a smile between them, quick, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. That was the difference between us. She thought she could keep her secrets hidden, while I had already unraveled them all. I watched the way she adjusted her posture, her tone shifting, becoming softer, more playful when he approached. It was almost laughable how oblivious she was to the cracks forming beneath her feet. I turned away, knowing what was to come. Julia had no idea that David's carefully cultivated career was hanging by a thread, thanks to a few anonymous tips I had sent to the right people. She didn't know that her friends had started to see through her, that the whispered conversations and suspicious glances weren't coincidences, but carefully placed seeds of doubt I had sown. Every time her phone buzzed with a message she didn't want me to see, I could feel the weight of my plan moving forward. There was satisfaction in the control, in the knowledge that every step I took was guiding her closer to her own undoing. I didn't need to rush. I had time. Watching Julia crumble, bit by bit, was far more rewarding than any immediate confrontation could have been. She thought she was safe, that her carefully curated world was still intact. She was wrong. I moved through the room, greeting a few colleagues, exchanging pleasantries as if nothing was out of the ordinary. In their eyes, I was still Nathan Black, reliable, composed, a man with everything in order. No one suspected the truth. I kept my voice steady, my smile easy, even as I watched Julia's world burn behind the scenes. It was all part of the plan, and every interaction tonight was another piece falling into place. There was a moment when Julia glanced at me from across the room, her eyes meeting mine. I could see the faint lines of tension around her mouth, a subtle shift in her expression. She was starting to feel it, the slow unraveling of everything she thought she controlled. But she wouldn't ask. She wouldn't dare question why things were going wrong. That was the beauty of it all. I had built my revenge on her silence, her ignorance, and her inability to see the larger game being played. As the night wore on, I excused myself, leaving the room with a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had taken the next step in dismantling her life, another thread pulled loose from the tapestry she had so carefully woven. She wouldn't see it coming, not until it was too late. And when she finally did, when the truth came crashing down around her, I would be standing there watching her fall. Just like she had watched me, only I wouldn't be the one broken. The first sign that something was off came late one night when Julia was sitting at the dining room table, tapping away on her phone. I'd walked in quietly, my footsteps softened by the thick carpet, and paused in the doorway, watching her from the shadows. There was nothing immediately suspicious in the way she sat there, her face illuminated by the screen, but something felt different. The way she smiled, a small, intimate smile, wasn't one I'd seen in a while. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to the stress at work. The late nights were nothing new and she'd always been career-driven. But the distance between us had grown steadily over the past few months. There were fewer shared moments, fewer lingering touches, fewer of the conversations we used to have late into the night. I told myself it was just a rough patch, that we would find our way back to each other like we always did. Yet, the signs were there, and over the following weeks, they became harder to dismiss. The late-night work events she never used to attend were suddenly a priority. The way her phone was always glued to her hand, her screen lighting up with notifications she never shared. She'd leave the room to take calls and brush off my questions with vague responses. I didn't press her. Not then. The last thing I wanted was to seem paranoid or overbearing. I tried to reason with myself that it was just my imagination, but something inside me had already shifted. A quiet voice, gnawing at the edges of my mind, whispered that something was wrong. Still, I wanted to believe she was loyal, that we were stronger than this. It wasn't until I found the first real piece of evidence that my suspicions crystallized into certainty. One evening, Julia had fallen asleep on the couch after yet another work event. Her phone, for once, wasn't in her hand, but had slipped down between the cushions. I don't know what prompted me to pick it up. Maybe I told myself I was only going to move it, set it on the coffee table where it wouldn't get damaged. But the moment I held it in my hand, I felt the weight of every suspicion I'd been pushing aside for weeks. It only took a few swipes to unlock it. She never hid her passcode from me. At that moment, I felt a sharp pang of guilt, a flicker of shame for invading her privacy. But that quickly faded as I scrolled through her messages and saw his name, David. It was the name of my boss, the man who'd been steadily climbing the corporate ladder above me, always effortlessly charming, always just slightly ahead. I knew he was younger, wealthier, and more ambitious, but I never imagined that he'd be interested in Julia. He was different, or so I had thought. The text thread between them was long and casual, full of in-jokes and references I didn't understand. But buried within those messages were the unmistakable signs of something more. There were no explicit admissions of their affair, no damning photos or exchanges. But the subtext was there in the way they talked about meeting for drinks after work, their plans for an upcoming weekend trip, and the far too intimate tone of their conversations. I read through the messages with a strange sense of detachment. There was no initial surge of anger, no urge to confront her. Instead, I felt cold, methodical. My mind shifted almost immediately into a different gear. There was no room for impulsive decisions now. If I confronted her in that moment, she would simply lie, deflect, maybe even gaslight me into thinking I'd misunderstood. She was clever like that. No, I needed something more, something concrete, and I needed time to think. I placed the phone back where it had fallen, careful not to disturb the rhythm of her shallow breathing. My heart should have been racing, but it wasn't. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the affair. This was about control, about the life we'd built together and how she had decided to tear it apart without a second thought. For the next few days, I watched her more closely than ever. Every interaction between us felt like a performance, as if we were playing the roles of husband and wife in a well-rehearsed play. I said nothing about what I knew, maintaining the facade of normalcy, but inside I was already starting to plan. The pivotal moment came a week later, when she came home late from work again. She was on her phone as she walked through the door, laughing softly at something I couldn't hear. She didn't even notice me standing in the kitchen, my back to the doorway, as she spoke in hushed tones to David. I watched her reflection in the window in front of me, her posture relaxed, comfortable. There was a lightness to her that she never showed around me anymore. She was happy, happy in her deception, happy in the lies she told both of us. That was the moment I decided I would not confront her. Not yet. Confrontation was too simple, too easy. What would it accomplish? A heated argument? A tearful apology? No, that wasn't enough. I needed to dismantle her life the way she had dismantled mine, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. She had no idea what was coming, and I relished the thought of her slowly realizing that everything she'd taken for granted was about to slip away. I began gathering more evidence. I wasn't satisfied with just text messages. I needed more. Needed to know exactly when and where they met, what excuses she was feeding me for her absences. I started tracking her movements, noting the times she claimed to be working late but was really meeting him. I hired a private investigator to follow her when I couldn't. The photos, the reports, it all became part of my arsenal, tools I would use when the time was right. All the while I maintained the mask. We ate dinner together, went to events, even spent weekends with mutual friends. I played the role of the supportive husband, asking about her day, pretending to care about the stories she told me. I let her believe she was still in control, that her affair was safely hidden from me. But inside I was waiting, plotting. The night I found the text messages had been the turning point, but it wasn't the moment that broke me. No, the breaking point would come later. For now, I needed to keep my emotions in check. Anger, sadness, betrayal, none of it mattered. What mattered was control. What mattered was making sure that when she finally realized what I knew, when she finally understood what I had been doing, it would be far too late for her to stop it. I was patient, I was methodical, and most importantly, I was in control. Julia thought she could keep me in the dark. She thought she could live two lives, deceive me and walk away unscathed. But she didn't know me as well as she thought she did. She didn't realize that I had been watching her closely for weeks now, learning her patterns, understanding her weaknesses. And she didn't know that I was already planning her downfall, step by calculated step. By the time she found out, it would be too late. After the discovery, there was no room for hesitation. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and it had to be done with precision. Julia had always been proud of her connections, her professional life, her carefully constructed social circle. She enjoyed being admired and respected, both at work and by the so-called friends she surrounded herself with. That's where I would strike first, slowly, imperceptibly, but with enough force to unravel the very fabric of her reputation. I started with small moves, subtle enough that no one, not even Julia, could suspect my hand behind the shifts. I began with her closest friend, Emily, the one she confided in more than anyone else. Emily was ambitious, always climbing the ladder at her law firm, and while Julia had been supportive of her success, there was an undercurrent of competition. I knew Julia well enough to understand that deep down, she resented Emily's achievements, though she would never admit it. It was easy to sow the seeds of doubt between them. A message sent from an anonymous account, one that hinted at conversations Julia had supposedly had behind Emily's back. It wasn't much, just enough to make Emily pause the next time she spoke to Julia. The hesitation was subtle, but it was there. When Emily casually mentioned a sensitive detail Julia had shared in confidence, and I subtly revealed it to a mutual acquaintance, the cracks began to form. Julia was oblivious, of course, still thinking everything was fine between them, not realizing the slow erosion of trust. From there, I expanded my web of influence. Julia's social circle, the tight-knit group of people she had cultivated over the years, was easy to manipulate. They thrived on gossip, on little scandals that could disrupt the delicate balance of their friendships. A few carefully placed rumors, always vague, always anonymous, were all it took to start eroding the trust they had in her. The idea that Julia might be talking behind their backs, or worse, exploiting them for her own gain, spread like wildfire. Soon enough, Julia started to feel the isolation. Her friends didn't confront her outright. No, that would have been too direct. Instead, they slowly pulled away. Invitations to dinners became sparse, And when they did invite her, the conversations were colder, more distant. She began noticing the shift, the quiet judgments she couldn't quite place. It was like watching her struggle against a tide she didn't know existed, and there was a twisted satisfaction in it. But that was only the beginning. Next, I turned my attention to her career. Julia had always prided herself on being a competent professional, someone others could rely on. At her firm, she was known for handling high-stakes projects with ease. Undermining her credibility there was more complex but no less satisfying. I had access to her email. She had never changed the password, a sign of how much she underestimated me. It wasn't difficult to plant small mistakes in her correspondence, altering details that were critical to her work. At first, it was just minor errors, dates swapped on a contract, files sent to the wrong person. Small enough to seem like harmless human error, but frequent enough to raise questions about her attention to detail. Her colleagues noticed. It started with whispers in the office, conversations she wasn't privy to. They began to question whether Julia was slipping, whether she was becoming too complacent. Of course, when Julia realized something was wrong, she had no idea why. She became paranoid, rechecking every email, double-checking her work. But the damage was done. She couldn't catch everything I manipulated from behind the scenes. And as the mistakes piled up, so did the doubt in her abilities. The tipping point came when a major client complained. A miscommunication, one I had orchestrated, led to a significant delay on a project, and Julia was the one held accountable. The reprimand from her boss was swift, though not public. Julia kept up appearances, but I could see it starting to affect her. She confided in me one evening, admitting she felt like things were falling apart at work. I offered her a sympathetic ear, assured her it was just a rough patch. She believed me. Why wouldn't she? I was still her husband after all, the person she thought she could rely on. Her confidence, once unshakable, was beginning to erode. But there was more to be done. Julia still had one pillar of stability left. David, the man she was so sure would provide her the future she thought she deserved. Sabotaging her relationship with David required a different approach. I couldn't risk direct confrontation, but I could plant doubts, just as I had done with her friends. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet, to follow them. I needed just enough evidence to suggest something was wrong between them. Not outright proof of Julia's infidelity, but subtle implications that she might not be as loyal as David believed. It didn't take long to gather what I needed. Photos of Julia at a cafe with a male colleague, seemingly innocent but taken from angles that suggested intimacy. Messages between Julia and another man, nothing too explicit but laced with enough flirtation to raise suspicion. I packaged these carefully, leaving no trace that they came from me, and made sure they found their way to David's inbox. The impact was immediate. David, as self-assured as he seemed, was not immune to jealousy. He confronted Julia, and while she denied any wrongdoing, the seed of doubt was planted. Their relationship began to strain under the weight of it. She tried to reassure him, but her lies, the same lies she had been feeding me, were now being scrutinized by the man she had left me for. I watched as Julia's world, once so carefully constructed, began to crumble around her. At work, she was increasingly isolated, her confidence shattered by the growing mistakes she couldn't explain. Her friends, once her support system, were now distant and cold, no longer trusting her. And now, David, the one person she thought she could rely on, was questioning her loyalty. She started coming home late, her face tight with stress, the dark circles under her eyes deepening. I could see the toll it was taking on her, though she refused to talk about it with me. I didn't push. I didn't need to. The more she withdrew, the more I tightened my grip. Then came the opportunity I had been waiting for. A company event where both Julia and David would be present, along with their colleagues and my own. I orchestrated the perfect setup. In the weeks leading up to the event, I had planted subtle rumors about Julia's involvement in a workplace scandal, careful to remain anonymous. It was enough to get people talking, but not enough for anyone to confront her directly. At the event, I made sure everything fell into place. I ensured that a private conversation between Julia and David, one that I knew would turn heated, was overheard by key individuals. Julia had no idea what was happening as her colleagues watched, whispering among themselves about the scandal she was supposedly involved in. David, already on edge from the seeds of doubt I had planted, didn't hold back. The argument was public, loud, and humiliating. Julia tried to maintain her composure, but the damage was done. By the time the night was over, she was the center of gossip, her reputation thoroughly tarnished. I stayed in the background, watching it unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. I had done it. I had turned her world upside down, and she had no idea I was behind any of it. When we returned home that night, she was silent. The confident, self-assured woman I had once known was gone, replaced by someone who was visibly unraveling. She tried to hide it, but the cracks were there. She couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. Not anymore. Sorry. And still, she didn't know that I was the one pulling the strings. She couldn't have imagined that the man she had betrayed was the one responsible for the collapse of everything she held dear. But there was still more to come. Her humiliation at the event was only the beginning. The true reckoning was yet to unfold. In the days that followed, I watched her retreat further into herself. She began avoiding work, calling in sick to avoid the whispers and sideways glances. At home, she was restless, pacing the house, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I continued to play the supportive husband, offering empty reassurances that things would get better, all while ensuring that they wouldn't. It wasn't long before David pulled away completely. The doubts I had planted, combined with Julia's deteriorating reputation, were too much for him to ignore. He ended their relationship in a cold, detached phone call, leaving her devastated. She had gambled everything on him, and now she had nothing left. I came home that evening to find her sitting in the dark, her eyes red from crying. She didn't look at me as I entered the room. For a moment, I almost felt a twinge of sympathy, a flicker of the love I once had for her. But it was fleeting. She had made her choices, and now she was paying the price. I sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm here," I said softly, knowing full well that my presence was the last thing she wanted. But she didn't push me away. She couldn't. There was no one else left to turn to. And in that moment, as I looked at her, broken and defeated, I knew that my plan was nearing its final stage. The final unraveling began when I decided to focus on the one remaining tether holding Julia to any sense of stability: David. As much as she had already lost, her career hanging by a thread, her friendships evaporating in a cloud of suspicion, David was her last source of validation, her one remaining lifeline. I knew that as long as she had him, she could cling to some sense of superiority, the belief that she had won by leaving me for a man she thought was better. I had to sever that tether carefully. It couldn't be obvious, couldn't be traced back to me. David was already starting to pull away, thanks to the seeds of doubt I'd planted. But now was the time to escalate. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet, someone who knew how to create just the right narrative. The goal wasn't to make David think Julia was outright cheating on him, too direct, too easy to dismiss. Instead, I wanted to build a story of distrust, one where every little action she took seemed to confirm his growing paranoia. The investigator was thorough. Over the next few weeks, I was fed a steady stream of carefully curated moments. Photos of Julia having a friendly drink with a male colleague, just a little too close, just a little too familiar. Texts from her phone, which I still had access to, doctored slightly to appear flirtatious, even though they were nothing more than professional correspondence. It was all so subtle, so carefully staged, that when the final confrontation came, David wouldn't be able to pinpoint the moment he lost trust in her. It would feel like a natural progression, the result of weeks of growing suspicion. I made sure David received the evidence in bits and pieces. A message from an unknown number, an anonymous email with a photo attachment, each one delivered at just the right time to maximize its impact. I could picture him reading them, his confidence eroding with each new revelation, and I imagined the tension it would create between them. David wasn't the type to confront her immediately. He would simmer in his own jealousy, let it fester until it became unbearable. The cracks in their relationship became visible almost immediately. Julia started coming home more agitated, her conversations with David clipped and defensive. She didn't confide in me, of course, but I overheard her on the phone with him late at night, her voice strained with frustration. It was all going exactly as I had planned, but the real turning point came at the company event. I'd been planning this moment for months. It was a large gathering hosted by David's company, with clients, colleagues, and upper management all in attendance. Julia was there, of course, her presence more a necessity than a desire by this point, given how her standing in the company had been steadily eroded. But she still clung to David, believing that as long as he was by her side, she could salvage something from the wreckage of her life. I had orchestrated every detail. In the weeks leading up to the event, I had planted rumors within the office, hinting at impropriety on Julia's part. I kept my hands clean, using intermediaries to ensure no one could trace the source of the gossip back to me. By the time the event rolled around, whispers were circulating about her. Nothing concrete, just enough to make people second-guess her behavior. The night of the event, I played the part of the dutiful husband, arriving separately from Julia but making sure to remain in the background, watching. David and Julia arrived together, but I could already see the tension between them. David's gaze lingered on her too long, his brow furrowed as if searching for confirmation of the doubts that had been eating at him for weeks. The final blow came when I arranged for the investigator to send David one last message, a carefully timed email with an attachment showing Julia in a compromising position. The image wasn't explicit, just enough to suggest an affair without providing concrete evidence. It arrived while David was mingling with his colleagues, his phone lighting up with a notification as he stood by the bar. I watched from across the room as he checked his phone, his expression darkening as he scrolled through the message. It didn't take long for the confrontation to erupt. David pulled Julia aside, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the buzz of conversation around them. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Julia's body language told me everything. She was defensive at first, her hands gesturing as she tried to explain, but David wasn't having it. His face was flushed with anger, his posture rigid, and I knew that everything I had orchestrated was coming to a head. The argument escalated quickly. David's voice rose, drawing the attention of those around them. Heads turned, whispers began, and soon the scene became the center of attention. Julia's face was flushed with embarrassment, her attempts to de-escalate only fueling David's fury. It was a public spectacle, exactly what I had intended. A moment of humiliation from which Julia couldn't recover. I stayed back, letting it unfold. There was no need for me to intervene, no need for me to do anything other than watch as the final act of my revenge played out. David stormed off, leaving Julia standing there, alone and mortified, under the watchful eyes of her colleagues and superiors. The fallout from the event was swift. Julia's reputation, already fragile, was irreparably damaged. The rumors that had been circulating now had confirmation. David's very public outburst solidified the narrative I had been building. Within days, she was called into a meeting with upper management, where they informed her that her position at the company was no longer tenable. She was given the option to resign quietly or face termination. She chose resignation, of course, though by then it didn't matter. Word had already spread, and her departure was seen as an admission of guilt. Her professional life was over, her once promising career reduced to ashes. At home, she was a shell of the woman she had once been. The confident, self-assured Julia who had left me for David was gone, replaced by someone broken and defeated. She hardly spoke to me, her days spent in silence, staring blankly at the walls of the house that had once felt like a home. David, of course, was long gone. He had cut ties with her completely after the event, and she hadn't heard from him since. I waited for the right moment to confront her. It had to be perfect. After all, this wasn't just about destroying her life. This was about making sure she knew exactly who had orchestrated her downfall. It came one evening, a few weeks after the event. I found her sitting in the living room, the lights dim, her face illuminated only by the flickering glow of the television. She looked up as I entered the room, her expression weary, but she didn't say anything. I sat down across from her, the weight of the moment settling over us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. I know about the affair, I said, my voice calm, controlled. Julia blinked, her face tightening with confusion, then realization. Nathan, there's no need to explain, I continued, cutting her off. I've known for a long time. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of life in her expression. What do you mean? I leaned forward, locking my gaze with hers. I know everything, Julia. The affair with David, the lies. All of it. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. I watched as the full weight of my words sank in, as the reality of what I was saying became clear to her. I've been behind everything, I said, my voice low and deliberate. The whispers at work, the rumors among your friends. Even David's suspicions. It was all me. Her mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock. You did this? I nodded slowly. I told you from the beginning, Julia. You shouldn't have underestimated me. She stared at me, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. I could see the tears welling in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse. Only the satisfaction of knowing that she finally understood the extent of her betrayal and the price she had paid for it. You ruined everything, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned back, crossing my arms. No, Julia, you ruined everything. I just made sure you paid for it. For a long time, she didn't say anything, the silence stretching between us. When she finally spoke again, her voice was hoarse, broken. What do you want from me? I stood up, looking down at her, my face unreadable. Nothing, I said quietly. I already got what I wanted. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there alone in the dark, with nothing but the wreckage of her life to keep her company. In the days that followed, Julia withdrew even further. She spent most of her time in the bedroom, the door closed, her presence in the house barely noticeable. I gave her space, knowing that there was nothing more to say, nothing more to do. My plan was complete. But as I sat in the quiet of the house, reflecting on everything that had happened, I couldn't shake a lingering feeling, a sense that, despite everything, something was missing. I can still hear her voice in my head sometimes. That evening, months ago now, when I overheard Julia with David, her words, sharp and cruel, slicing through what little was left of my trust in her. I hadn't gone looking for it. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but I was there outside our bedroom, frozen in place as I listened to her mock me to him. The conversation was light, filled with laughter at first, but it quickly turned darker. The way she spoke about me, the man she'd spent over a decade of her life with, was with such disdain. It wasn't just the affair that hurt, it was the complete lack of respect, the contempt in her voice as she stripped away the value of every memory we'd made together. I remember standing there, my chest tight, breath shallow, as she told David she never really loved me. That our marriage had been one of convenience, that I was simply safe. The word hit me harder than anything else she said. In that moment, I realized she hadn't just betrayed me with her body. She'd betrayed the very foundation of our relationship. Everything we had built, everything I thought we shared, was nothing more than a facade. And that's when the anger settled in, cold and calculating. I didn't confront her then. That would have been too easy, too impulsive. Julia was too skilled at manipulation for a confrontation to work in my favor. If I lashed out, it would give her the upper hand, a chance to play the victim, to twist the narrative. No, what I needed was patience, a slow burn, like the one she'd inflicted on me for so long. Revenge had to be calculated, precise, and I had to be in control every step of the way. In the days that followed, I pretended nothing had changed. I watched her closely, observing the little things that had once seemed insignificant, but now screamed of her deception. The way she disappeared to take phone calls in another room, the sudden work trips, the late nights. I saw it all with fresh eyes, and with each new observation, my plan solidified. I began gathering information, slowly, methodically. I installed spyware on her phone, set up cameras around the house, tracked her every movement. It wasn't difficult, and she was careless, too confident in her lies to suspect anything. The more I uncovered, the more my anger transformed into something cold, something calculated. This wasn't about exploding in a fit of rage. This was about dismantling her, piece by piece, just as she had done to me. But it wasn't enough to ruin her relationship with David. No, that was just a part of it. Julia's sense of identity was deeply tied to her career, her friendships, her reputation. I knew that to truly make her feel the weight of what she'd done, I had to take all of it away. And I had to do it in a way that left her questioning where it had all gone wrong. So I started small, planting seeds of doubt in her friendships, manipulating events at work, but always staying one step ahead. Watching her unravel slowly was more satisfying than I could have imagined. I could see the confusion in her eyes when things started to go wrong, the way she second-guessed herself, wondering if she was losing her touch. Her friends began pulling away, her professional reputation faltered, and all the while she had no idea I was the one orchestrating it all. But the real turning point came when I overheard that conversation between her and David, the one that solidified my resolve, the one where she laid bare her true feelings for me. In that moment, any remnants of doubt I had about my plan vanished. I knew I had to destroy her completely, and I couldn't rest until it was done. The final piece of my plan was the public humiliation at the company event. That was the moment when everything came crashing down for Julia. She lost David, her job, her reputation, everything she had clung to so desperately. And when we got home that night and I finally revealed that I had known about the affair all along, I saw the light in her eyes dim. She knew then that she had been defeated, that there was no way to recover from the devastation I had wrought. But even in that moment, as I stood over her, watching her break down, I felt a strange emptiness settle in. The satisfaction I had anticipated, the sense of triumph. It was there, but it wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. Something was missing. In the days that followed, Julia retreated further into herself. She became a ghost in the house, barely speaking, her movements listless. I didn't interfere. My part was done. The wreckage of her life lay scattered around her, and she had no one left to blame but herself. But in those quiet moments, alone with my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had won. I had taken everything from her. So why did it feel like I had lost something too? It wasn't long after that I began reflecting on my own role in all of this. In my quest to destroy Julia, I had become someone I didn't recognize. Cold, calculating, and detached. I had once been a man who loved deeply, who trusted completely. But now I was something else entirely, and I couldn't shake the nagging question. Had the betrayal changed me? Or had I always been this way, lying dormant until the right trigger pushed me over the edge? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my revenge had come at a cost I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just Julia's life I had dismantled, it was my own. In seeking to punish her, I had become consumed by the very darkness I had tried to fight. And now, as I sat in the quiet of the house, the echoes of our broken marriage surrounding me, I was left to confront the aftermath. Julia didn't leave the house much anymore. She spent most of her time in the bedroom, the door closed, the blinds drawn. I didn't check on her often, and when I did, it was out of a sense of obligation more than concern. She was a shell of the woman she had once been, and yet, as much as I had hated her for what she had done, I couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. Not for the revenge, I still believed she deserved every piece of it, but for what we had become. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if things could have been different. If, instead of plotting her downfall, I had confronted her directly, tried to work through the betrayal. But then I remembered her words to David, the way she had so casually dismissed our marriage, and the regret would dissipate, replaced once again by the cold satisfaction that she had gotten what she deserved. But satisfaction wasn't enough. I had destroyed her, but in the process, I had destroyed a part of myself as well. And now, in the aftermath of it all, I was left wondering what came next. Julia wasn't going to recover from this, I knew that much. Her career was over, her relationships shattered, and she had no way of rebuilding the life she had once taken for granted. She would remain here, in this house, a shadow of her former self, while I continued on with my life. But what kind of life would that be? I had spent so long focused on revenge that I hadn't thought about what came after. Now that it was done, I found myself adrift, unsure of where to go from here. The man I had once been was gone, replaced by someone I didn't fully understand. I had thought revenge would bring closure, but instead it had left me with more questions than answers. And so I sit here in the aftermath of everything I'm reporting, reflecting on what I've achieved. I destroyed Julia, yes. But I also destroyed the life we had, the life I had imagined for us before everything fell apart. And now as I look ahead, I can't help but wonder if I've lost more than I've gained. There's a strange sense of closure in knowing that Julia will never be able to hurt me again, but it's a hollow victory. The scars of her betrayal run deep, and I'm not sure they'll ever fully heal. The man I was before is gone, and in his place is someone who has seen the darkest parts of himself and come out the other side, but not unscathed. I wonder if I'll ever find peace, or if the consequences of my actions will haunt me for the rest of my life. For now, all I can do is live with the choices I've made, knowing that the revenge I sought has left me with as many wounds as it did her. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real cost of betrayal. The final move in my carefully crafted game was about precision, timing, and leaving no doubt in Julia's mind that I had orchestrated every single blow to her life. Everything was set in motion, her career in shambles, her friends abandoning her, and David walking out of her life. But she still didn't know. She still thought the universe had simply turned against her, that her failures were a matter of bad luck, and that David's sudden distrust was born of his own insecurities. That was the last illusion I had to shatter. The moment came one evening when I found her sitting alone in the living room, her hands nervously picking at the hem of her sleeve. The air around her seemed heavier than usual. There was no television on, no sound of the radio, just the oppressive quiet of a life that had become unbearably small. She didn't notice me at first. She hadn't noticed much of anything for weeks. "Julia," I said, my voice calm, measured. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow and tired. It was a far cry from the woman who had once been so confident, so sure of herself. Now she was a shadow, broken under the weight of everything she couldn't understand. There was a flicker of something in her expression, hope maybe, that I was about to offer her some comfort, some small assurance that things would get better. But I had none of that to give. I know about the affair. It was the simplest statement, delivered without emotion, but it hit her like a punch to the gut. Her body went rigid, her face paling as the words registered. I could see the calculations racing behind her eyes, the frantic attempt to piece together how I could have found out. For a moment, she said nothing, and I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and suffocating. "How?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've known for a long time," I continued, stepping closer but keeping my tone as calm as it had been. "David, the late nights, the lies, I've known everything." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, searching for something to say. There was no defense she could offer, nothing she could deny. The truth was too clear now. "I don't understand," she muttered, her voice shaking. Why didn't I confront you?" I finished for her, letting the question hang in the air. "Because that would have been too easy, Julia. Confronting you would have given you power. It would have given you the chance to twist the story, to play the victim. I couldn't allow that." Her eyes widened, a mixture of confusion and fear flooding her face. She was beginning to understand, but not fully. Not yet. You did this?" Her voice cracked as the realization crept in, but it still wasn't enough. She hadn't seen the whole picture yet. "I did all of it," I said, my voice unyielding. "The whispers at work, the doubts in David's mind, the destruction of your career, your reputation. Every single piece of your life falling apart, Julia, that was me." I watched as her face twisted with disbelief, As the weight of my words sunk deeper, her hands were trembling now, clenching into fists at her sides, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But she didn't. Instead, she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "You ruined me," she choked out, her voice muffled and thick with tears. Why would, why would you do this? It was a pathetic question, and I almost didn't answer, but I wanted her to know. I wanted her to fully grasp the magnitude of her betrayal and how carefully I had crafted her downfall. "Because you betrayed me," I said simply, taking a step closer. "Not just with David, but with everything. You betrayed our life, our marriage. You threw it all away for someone who didn't even care enough to stay." She shook her head, sobbing now, her body shaking with the force of it. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. "You thought you could have it all, didn't you? The affair, the lies. You thought you could just walk away from our life together and not face the consequences." "I didn't mean to," she began, her voice broken, but I cut her off. "You did. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think I'd ever find out." My voice was cold, but I didn't feel the rage I thought I would. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about justice. It was about showing her that actions have consequences. Julia's sobs were now uncontrolled, her hands gripping her head as if she could block out my words by sheer force of will. But I wasn't done. "I gave you everything," I continued. "I was the husband you pretended to want. And in return, you made me feel like a fool. You stripped away my dignity. So I took yours." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her entire body was racked with sobs, and the sight of her broken like that, while satisfying, left me with a strange, hollow feeling. I had spent so long plotting this, so long waiting for this moment, that now, with the revenge complete, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. I watched her for a long moment, the rise and fall of her sob, slowly quieting into soft, pitiful whimpers. Then I turned and left her there, alone in the dark. As I walked through the house, my mind was filled with a strange sense of detachment. It was over. Julia was ruined. The revenge I had crafted so meticulously had reached its end. But the question that had been nagging at me for weeks still lingered. What now? I went into the kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain against the windows, the only noise that filled the space. I poured myself a glass of water, staring at the ripples on the surface, trying to ground myself in the present. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The satisfaction I had been expecting, the closure I thought would come with Julia's complete and utter downfall, it wasn't there. I had imagined that by the end of it all, I would feel vindicated, whole, like I had restored some balance to the universe. But instead, all I felt was emptiness. I went to bed that night alone, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Julia didn't come to bed. She hadn't in weeks. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite grasp. The revenge had been perfect. Every step had been calculated, every move deliberate. So why did it feel like I had lost something too? The next morning, Julia was still in the living room, curled up on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She didn't say a word to me as I passed her on my way to the kitchen. I didn't acknowledge her either. The finality of our interaction the night before hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. But as I sat at the kitchen table drinking my coffee, the hollowness crept back in. I had spent so long consumed by my need for revenge that I hadn't considered what came after. What was left now? The woman I had loved, despite her betrayal, was a shell of her former self, and I had no one else. No one to share my life with, no one to rebuild with. The house felt unbearably quiet. I looked out the window, watching the rain fall in steady sheets, and for the first time I allowed myself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I had gone too far. Julia had deserved consequences for what she had done, but had I destroyed too much? In my quest to make her pay, had I also destroyed the part of me that could ever feel whole again? The thoughts were unsettling, and I quickly pushed them away. What was done was done. There was no going back now. I stood up, setting my coffee cup in the sink, and walked back into the living room. Julia hadn't moved, her body still curled up on the couch, her face hidden in the cushions. I paused for a moment, watching her, wondering if there was anything left to say, anything left to salvage. But there wasn't. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the front door, leaving Julia behind. And for the first time in months, I felt the full weight of what I had done. The final move had been played, and I had won, but the victory, once so sweet in my mind, was bitter now. I had gotten what I wanted, but at what cost? In the aftermath of everything, I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home. Julia was gone, emotionally, physically, spiritually. The devastation I had orchestrated was complete. And yet, as I sat there in the oppressive silence, I couldn't escape the gnawing emptiness that had settled in my chest. The satisfaction I had been chasing, the sense of triumph I had imagined was fleeting, if it had ever been real at all. I thought back to the moment I had confronted her. The way her face had crumbled as I revealed that I had known everything from the beginning, that her destruction was entirely my doing. There had been no rage in me, no dramatic outburst, only the cold, calculated delivery of my final truth. And as I watched her fall apart, as her sobs filled the space between us, I realized that something inside me had shifted, something irrevocable. Julia had paid for her betrayal. She had lost everything, her career, her reputation, David. But what had I gained? I had devoted so much time, so much energy to dismantling her life piece by piece that I had neglected to consider what came after. My identity had become so entangled in revenge that now, without it, I felt directionless. The house echoed with the absence of her presence. I had expected to feel a sense of relief, but instead, there was only quiet. The kind of quiet that suffocates, that makes you realize how much space another person occupies in your life, even when they've wronged you. I had wanted her gone, but now, with her absence, the house felt hollow, like a shell. I replayed every step of my plan in my mind, wondering if there had been a different path I could have taken. Could I have confronted her early on? Could we have found some way to fix the wreckage of our marriage? But each time I entertained the thought, I returned to the memory of that conversation I'd overheard. Her voice, so callous, so dismissive of everything we had shared. No, there had never been another option. The betrayal was too deep, too personal. She had taken something from me that could never be repaired. But in destroying her, had I destroyed myself as well? I thought about what my life had become. In the months leading up to Julia's downfall, my entire existence had revolved around plotting, calculating, and executing her ruin. I had pushed away friends, distanced myself from anything that didn't serve my goal. And now that the goal was achieved, there was nothing left. No connections, no purpose, just the empty shell of a man who had once been defined by love, now defined by revenge. I stood up and wandered through the house, each room a reminder of the life we had once shared. The bedroom where we had once slept side by side now felt foreign to me. The kitchen where we had shared meals was sterile and cold. Every object, every piece of furniture, felt tainted by what had happened, by the lies and deceit that had slowly rotted our marriage from the inside out. I walked to the window and stared out at the rain falling steadily against the glass. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the chaos that had consumed my life. I wondered if anyone else had ever felt this way, this strange mix of victory and loss, this realization that revenge, no matter how well executed, doesn't fill the void it's meant to. I thought about Julia, wherever she was now. I had no idea where she had gone after she left the house, and I hadn't asked. It didn't matter. She was gone from my life, and that was what I had wanted. But I couldn't shake the image of her broken, sobbing on the couch, her spirit crushed under the weight of my actions. She'd been cruel, yes, but had I become worse? I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a realization that perhaps I hadn't been entirely justified in what I had done. I had wanted justice, but what I had enacted felt more like destruction. And now, standing in the wreckage of what had once been my life, I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost more than I had gained. The rain continued to fall, and I turned away from the window, sinking back into the chair in the living room. I stared at the empty space where Julia had once sat, and for the first time since this all began, I felt the full weight of my actions. The house was silent, but my thoughts were loud, crashing into one another with questions I didn't have answers for. What was left of me now? Who was I without this quest for revenge driving me? I had spent so long being consumed by anger, by the need to destroy her, that I didn't know how to exist without it. The man I had been before, the man who had loved her, trusted her, was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and I wasn't sure I liked who I had become. The satisfaction of seeing Julia fall had been real, but fleeting, and now all I was left with was this sense of emptiness, of questions that would never be answered. I had gotten what I wanted, but at what cost? The house remained quiet as I sat there, the rain a constant rhythm in the background. I had achieved my goal. I had won, but the victory felt hollow, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost more than I had ever realized. Perhaps, in the end, revenge wasn't the answer. Perhaps, in seeking to destroy Julia, I had only succeeded in destroying myself. And now, all that was left was the empty silence of a life that no longer had meaning.